This is our mini lecture on example 1.23 from Analyzing Classical Form. The expectation is that you have a printout on which you can take notes and that you've already been to the website and you've listened to this multiple times such that when you look at the notation, you hear the music. We'll be looking at 4 specific structural events in this excerpt. I'll go ahead and measure the numbers. That will be easier when we're discussing this. There are 3 prolongational progressions that we will specifically find within this excerpt. One of them is the neighboring chord, and that's discussed on page 12 in the textbook. Another prolongational progression that we will look at is the pedal point, and that's discussed on both pages 3 and 11 in the text. And the third prolongational progression that we will look at in this excerpt is the substitute harmony, and that is discussed on page 13. And the substitute harmony that we find in this excerpt is specifically the same as the one notated in example 1, 10a. We will also look at the cadential progression at the end of this phrase, and it is specifically a half cadence, and that's discussed on both pages 4, 5, and 17, 18, and we also are going to have that instance of a cadential 6/4 and that moves into a root position 5 chord, and Kaplan discusses that on page 9 in the textbook. So let's start with a traditional Roman numeral analysis. This is in the key of G. There are some accidentals here, but nothing that would indicate E minor. So we label the uppercase G for G major underneath the clef and key signatures. It's ideal if you have your think in the key page for G major, but at least spell a G major chord. G major scale, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, diminished, and G. Notice that I've used uppercase for the letter names that are the root of a major triad, and lowercase letters for those letters that are the root of minor triads and the diminished triad on the leading tone. Think in the key. Traditional Roman numeral analysis, G, D, B, D. The left hand has the chord arpeggios, so we start off with the 1 chord in measure 1. On beat 3 of measure 1, the left hand arpeggiation changes. A, D, C, D. Well, that has 3 of the 4 notes for D, F sharp, A, and C. The melody, D, C, B, C. These C's are passing tones, or you can say they're the 7th. The B is not a chord tone, so the B is a lower neighbor. This is a 5/7 chord. A in the bass makes it the 4/3 inversion. Remembering that if it had been a root position, we would put 5/7, first inversion, 5/6/5, second inversion, 5/4/3, and that third inversion, 5/4/2. Downbeat of measure 2 and all of measure 2, we return to the tonic. Notice that we're taking as the main bass note, the functional bass note, the note that occurs on the beat. So our functional bass notes here are G, G, A, G, 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 G. Going on to measure 3, G, E, C, E. This is our C, E, G chord, which is the 4 chord. G is in the bass, which puts it in 6/4 inversion. For right now, we have all these chromatic notes. I'm not going to deal with beat 3 in measure 3. Notice that in the melody, da 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 dum, G is part of the C, E, G. A, that's our upper neighbor. G, F sharp is a passing tone. E is part of our chord. D is a passing tone that has a lower neighbor. Yeah, a passing tone having a lower neighbor. And furthermore, that is a chromatic lower neighbor before we get back to the D. So this C sharp is a chromatic lower neighbor to the D that is part of the 1 chord when we return to measure 4. You have by now figured out or noticed that measures 2 and 4 are repetition. Measure 5, A, D, C, D. This is the 5-4-3 that we encountered at the end of measure 1. Notice that now we have the F sharp, C, A, F, A, B, C. The F sharp is included in the melody. We have a B passing tone, 5, 4, 3. Measure 6, G, D, B, D, moves back to a 1 chord. E, E, B, G, E. There's a 6 chord in root position, moving on to B, G, D, G, moving on to a 1 chord in first inversion. Take a look at the right hand, the melody, D, B, G. Measure 2 has the same rhythm as measure 6, but measure 2, D, B, G. The G falls underneath the D and the B. In measure 6, the G is above. So compared to measures 2 and 4, measure 6 has octave displacement, or we can call this a register transfer. Either one of those terms adequately describes the fact that the G at the end of the motive in measure 6 is an octave higher than that in measures 2 and 4. Measure 7, in the bass, C, E, G, and then E. So C, E, G is our 4 chord with the C on beats 1 and 2 as the lowest note. It's root position to start with, and on beat 3 moves over to 4, 6. Now, I'm saying it's a 4 chord. Someone seeing the A on the beat may be considering calling this an A, C, E, G, a 2-7 chord. I'm not going to endorse that, but that's a retrospective analysis. This is C, E, G. At the very end, I noticed that on beat 3, D, C, B, C. Well, the B is definitely a lower neighbor. The D came from an E that is a chord tone, so the D is a passing tone. So on beat 3, we have a passing tone. If I go back to beat 2, F, G, D sharp is a chromatic lower neighbor. The F sharp came from a G. The F sharp lies in between the G and the E, which are chord tones. F sharp is a passing tone. So on beats 2 and 3, what falls on the beat are non-chord tones. So that leads me to retrospectively say that A is probably a non-chord tone. A, G, F sharp, G. F sharp is a lower neighbor. A is preceded by a rest. If you consider it coming from G, the previous pitch that sounds, then it's an upper neighbor. Some people would call this an incomplete neighbor because it's coming from a rest, but it is an upper neighbor to the G. So it's some sort of neighbor regardless of how you call it, what you call it. Leading into measure 8, D in the bass, G is a 4th above it, B is the 6th above that, so we have the 6-4. Moving to G, F sharp, so the 4th above moves to the 3rd above, B, C is an upper neighbor back to the B, just a little ornament there, A, so this is essentially B, A, 6 moving to 5th above. On page 9, Kaplan talks about this as being all part of a dominant. You may have learned that a cadential 6-4 goes with the Roman numeral 164. Why? Because if I'm just looking at letter names and I'm only looking at that particular collection of pitches that falls on the downbeat of measure 8, then I'm going to say it's a GBD chord. But in the whole context of the G moving to F sharp and the B moving to A, this is really about D, F sharp, A, and the 6/4 is an ornament to the 5/3, to the root position 5 chord. So calling it a tonic 6/4 is old-fashioned. And so we want to be up to date in our analysis. We will call this a 5/6/4, a cadential 6/4 on the dominant. So this is a traditional Roman numeral analysis. We've talked about the register transfer, octave displacement. We've talked about our cadential 6/4 resolving to a position dominant chord. Now let's go back and locate the 3 prolongational progressions as well as look at the cadential progression. The neighboring chord occurs in measure 1 on beat 3. And in Kaplan's analytical annotations, he would put this in parentheses. He might also label that in for neighboring chord the same way that we labeled non-chord tones with an in. So from 1 to the neighboring 5/4/3 back to 1, that is all part of a tonic prolongation. In measure 3, we have the 4/6/4. This also contributes to a tonic prolongation that is a pedal point. G, 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 G. This is part of a pedal point tonic prolongation. Thus far we have measures 1 through 4 as being a tonic prolongation. Let me say one more thing about the 4/6/4. Remember that a second inversion chord with the 5th in the bass is the weakest inversion of a triad. I like to joke that it's like standing a triad on its head or doing a handstand, which you know most of us, unless we took gymnastics as a child or at some point in our lives, most of us can't hold a handstand for more than a nanosecond. It's weak to stand on your hands or to do a headstand. So this is 4/6/4. Rarely is a 4/6/4 going to be anything other than a weak inversion of a triad. So measures 1 through 4, tonic prolongation. Measure 5, we return to the dominant 7th, but again, it's in 4/3 inversion, like the end of measure 1. And afterwards, after measure 5, we return to measure 6, and there is the tonic. So the tonic prolongation extends into measure 6. We've had a neighboring chord, pedal point, neighboring chord, and back to 1. Measure 6, we have 1/6/1/6. The 6th chord is also part of a tonic prolongation, and that is that substitute harmony. This same exact Roman numeral progression is in example 1.10a. Remember that substitute harmonies are of the same harmonic function. 6 is tonic function. It's surrounded by tonic chords, 1 connecting to 1/6. Now we're getting into the cadential progression. 4 to 4/6, the cadential 6/4/5/3. This is a half cadence because we arrive on the 5. Kaplan likes to label the cadences beneath the score. I personally like to see it above, but whichever is fine. He does put it in a rectangle. He would also like to bracket the chords that are part of the cadential progression. I would take it back to the 1/6, and that's the cadential progression. We will read more about cadential progressions. So, summary. We had 3 different types of prolongational progressions: the neighboring chord at the end of measure 1 and all of measure 5, a pedal point, and the substitute harmony. Our cadential progression is a half cadence. I'm going to diagram out the harmonic function. Measures 1 through 6 are all tonic. It's a tonic prolongation, so 1 through 6 is tonic function. Measure 7 is the predominant function, and measure 8 is the dominant function. I like to bracket, this is not anything in Kaplan, I like to bracket units of harmonic function from tonic over to the next tonic. This ends on a half cadence, so I leave it an open bracket, and we certainly expect measure 9 to return to the tonic. This concludes our discussion of example 1.23, in which we discussed 3 different types of prolongational progressions and a half cadence.